Welcome to the Modern Husbands Podcast, where any combination of Dr. Bruce Ross, Christian Sherrill, and Brian Page host national experts who share winning ideas to manage money and the home as a team. The great news is that inflation is back to 2 to 3%, but the prices for some of what we buy remain high. In today's episode, entitled Why Prices Are Higher, Just the Facts, we address why. Our guests are Dr. Jennifer Davidson and Mike Raymer. Dr. Davidson is the president of the Nebraska Council on Economic Education and associate professor of practice in economics at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Mike Raymer is the executive director of the Georgia Council on Economic Education and a former award-winning economics educator. You will finish the podcast episode understanding how to spot the nonsense shared on social media and some news outlets, so you and your partner can have an informed, fact-based conversation about inflation and how you can manage it in your home. Enjoy the show. All right, folks, thrilled to have Mike Raymer and Dr. Jennifer Davidson join us today. Thank you to you two for taking time out of your day.
Sure. Always happy to spread the word of Econ Ed. We're recording this and it's Econ Ed month too, so bonus for that.
It is, and it's going to be released in October. So
Sweet. October
is Economic Education Month. And Mike Raymer, who, if you're watching this in video, that is not Rob Lowe, it is Mike Raymer. He has like 47 different Econ Education Month t-shirts. He is an absolute fanatic when it comes to this. We are going to talk about high prices because there are all kinds of like myths and misunderstandings about this. And I could think of no two better people than an economics professor and an award-winning economic educator whose entire mission in his organization is to provide economic and financial education. And so together, us three, and this used to be what I did, I used to teach personal finance and economics, we're just going to, in plain language, explain what's going on with prices. Like, what does inflation actually mean? Because there's all kinds of myths out there that drive all three of us nuts. And it's frustrating because there are, real rational reasons for all of these things. And, people need to understand the basics of why prices are higher, right? Why prices are lower. So that's what we're going to discuss today. And the best way to start is just to discuss how is inflation measured? So Dr. Davidson, do you want to kick us off with that?
Sure, I sure can. So inflation in general is measured. First of all, let's define it, right? It's a general rise in the level of prices. It is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And what it is they collect pricing from 75 different urban cities across the U.S., month after month after month, all of this pricing information. And then they create an index, which is called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which gives you the tool to measure changes over time. So you can look at the percent change over time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So I can talk further. This basket of goods has everything in it that your typical family would buy, just to get you through your life, right? So it's transportation, it's housing, it's food, it's energy, it's medical, it's all of these things go into this typical basket of goods, and then we can measure changes in the price over time for cost of living, essentially.
And Mike, as I'm thinking about, if I'm listening to this, I'm probably thinking to myself, well, wow, like housing prices have been kind of wonky for the last few years, but I'm not buying a house. So does inflation really impact me? Is there a different measure that is more reflective of people who are maybe not necessarily looking to buy a home tomorrow?
I mean, I think the ultimate measure is when I go to the grocery store, and people go shopping and buy, consumer goods. Are you looking for a specific?
That's core inflation, right?
Yeah,
we can talk about that. So core inflation is going to exclude food and energy because those two pieces are really, really volatile.
Okay. All right. So knowing that food and energy are volatile, I know this wasn't on our list of questions, but why? Like, why energy?
So much of energy it's a global commodity, right? I mean, you're getting, oil, for instance, from all over the world, and when things happen in country X, prices in country Y could go up. And that's happening all the time in real time in supply and demand. I mean, I don't know if we've uttered those words yet, but supply and demand is so much a huge part of this.
Yeah, that's
So,
where I was going to go next. Exactly right. So when
yeah,
we're talking about prices, I mean, I think what you want to get to is where do prices come from, right? And really,
Yeah.
that is, I'm going to do that's the interaction of supply and demand. So how those two, the producers and the consumers, are interacting, that's where prices come from. Uh, And I think that's a huge piece of education that we have to continue to do over and over. Is it
Yeah.
nuanced? Absolutely. But fundamental economic analysis of prices is supply and demand.
And it's and what is important to stress there is that supply and demand is a result of a market, in that there's nobody behind the curtain that is controlling those things. It's lots of different factors and folks who are influencing those things. And you brought up the fact that there could be global issues that are going to impact energy, for example, and there's a lot going on in the Middle East right now. There's the invasion of Ukraine, and we saw what happened when that occurred. And so, and all of these things factor into rising prices. It's, as you said, it's supply and demand. It's a marketplace. So knowing that, like, it's not as if the United States is this helpless country where we just allow for the marketplace to completely dictate what is happening, right? We do have some guardrails to try to influence the direction of rising prices and unemployment. So who is it that is ultimately responsible for managing inflation in the United States? Mike, why don't you take this one?
so it's the Federal Reserve System, right? That with their dual mandate of basically stable prices and full employment. They're out there studying the economy, collecting data all the time, and it's through their actions with interest rates, basically, in a very simplified version, they increase or decrease the supply of money, which, if all things work as planned, should bring prices down when they're too high.
And the Federal Reserve is a government entity? Like, walk us through that structure.
Jennifer, you want to dive
Yeah,
into
sure.
that one?
It's a quasi government agency. I can't stress enough the importance of the independence of the Federal Reserve, because we really need them to be thinking long term in terms of their decision making. You don't want it to become part of any election cycle for their decision making, right? So they really are a powerful quasi governmental entity. And what they do with that interest rate ripples through the economy for a long, long time. So the chair of the Federal Reserve is nominated by the president, confirmed by Congress. So there's all of these things, 14-year terms, because we want that really long-term thinking. But they operate independently. It's a very, very important piece for people to understand.
And so I'm here in Atlanta, and my organization, we do a lot of work with the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. They're our number one partner. So I'm there pretty regularly. I mean, I have a meeting there Monday, for instance, and the people that work there are, private citizens. They're not elected to those jobs, and they're many of them are economists, and they're living in the same country as we are. So they want the best for everyone, because that's they're impacting their own lives. And as Jennifer said, they're independent people, right? They're not political. They're making decisions, I think, to make the economy better across the board in this country.
And for those of you who are into history, economic history is of particular importance here. A good book is This Time is Different, and it dives into the different ways in which previous economies have crashed, and there's a theme there, and the theme is that when politicians have direct control over the money supply, economies collapse. And we see that we're seeing that in Venezuela right now, because politicians are all about power, and the best way to obtain power is to mess around with the currency in a way where it suits you for right now, right at this moment, which isn't necessarily best for the long term. And that's why our system is so beautiful, because of the Fed's independence from lawmakers going in there and kind of like fiddling around with things to try to keep power. So I was glad that you brought it up, that it's not, the Federal Reserve is not run by Congress. It's not run by the president. It's a quasi-government entity. Okay, so inflation. Go ahead.
If I can add something really quick. Actually, if you ever come to Atlanta, you can visit the Atlanta Fed's Money Museum. And when you walk in, they have a display of currencies from around the world, that like the highest inflated currencies ever. And, they'll have a note with, like 12 zeros on it. And it's because of what you just said, where the elected officials came in and let's just print more money. And then another part of the museum, it's got, talks about the inflation in the 70s, when inflation was really high in this country. And Paul Volcker, the chair of the Fed at the time, raised interest rates to very, very high levels compared to what we're used to now. And there is a 2x4 that a construction worker sent to the Fed, basically blaming Volcker because interest rates were so high and people weren't building houses because interest rates might have been 14% or something like that. So it really kind of gets to the point of, this is what the Fed's doing over here, raising rates to sort of cool the economy down. Over here, you got these notes that show when politicians are in charge, you might have 12 zeros on your note. It's great. Come to Atlanta and see the museum.
Two points I want to make. Actually, wherever you live, there's probably a Federal Reserve or a branch relatively near you, and do exactly what Mike suggested. Go visit. Most of them have some kind of money museum. Take your kids. It's a great educational opportunity. And then the second point I want to make is memories are short. So if we're looking over historically, we're still enjoying relatively low inflation and interest rates. So it depends on your frame of reference. And people forget. So still relatively low if we look back to even maybe World War II was the last huge spike, but it's been really, really low. 70s, late 70s, again, another spike. But over time, we're still in a very calm place.
Yeah, and for so long in our country, inflation was so low. I mean, forever.
Yeah, and I think that's why people are really feeling it right now, right? We, in our short term, my relative adulthood, maybe not quite, but it's been almost 0 or 1%, 2% for a long, long time. And so this is sort of a shock to the system for most people.
And if you're listening, check the notes. I'm going to write a blog post about this with the graphics from the Federal Reserve. There's a great tool called Fred that's through the St. Louis Federal Reserve. And I'm just going to literally embed inflation rates over time, interest rates over time. And you'll see that when you look at the bigger picture, we actually have really super low inflation right now. We actually have really low interest rates right now to buy a home. But like you guys said, recency bias is playing into this. Like we're like, oh my gosh, we could have gotten a mortgage for 3.9%. Those are the lowest rates in history. And they came about, frankly, because of the housing collapse in 2008. Like how quickly we forget that 1 in 4 homes were literally underwater, meaning people owed more than their home was worth. And so the Fed had to literally make free money, essentially, so people would start borrowing again and we could correct this. And so, like in 2013 or in 2019, could you get a 3.9% mortgage? Yeah, of course. And that was basically the long benefit of the worst housing collapse in the history of the United States of America that almost destroyed our country. We can't forget that. And if it wasn't for the fast action of the Federal Reserve at that time, when Ben Bernanke at that time intervened, the world would look very different than it looks today.
Yeah.
So,
and again, the importance of the independence of the Fed and the Fed in general as this backstop to the economy.
Yes. Okay, so the third question is, if inflation is down, why are groceries expensive? Who would like to take that?
I guess we probably both have some answers to this.
Yeah, you start. I'll fill in after you.
And to me, that this kind of question, there's so many answers. I think a lot of some folks maybe want one silver bullet answer, like this is the reason why. I have some notes here. Supply chain issues are at the top of my list. When I buy fruits and vegetables in my household, they're coming from all over the world, right? And there's things going on in different parts of the country or different parts of the world that maybe I'm not attuned to. but it might be a flood in, pick a country in South America that's growing my bananas or something like that. So something as small as that could trigger prices to go up. Corporate profits are at a record high. I've been reading a lot about corporations during, when COVID was around and prices started going up. The prices went up because of certain factors, and they've kind of kept them there because the profits are great right now for some corporations. Production costs are up. Brian, you mentioned energy prices. If energy prices go up, farmers got to pay more for fuel. I've got a lot of farmer friends from where I grew up, and I was talking to them not long ago, and they were just talking about like the price of fuel to fill a huge tractor or to buy a tractor. Like those prices are up, so they're going to pass those costs along. Industry consolidation. If you go to the grocery store and you're shopping at, Kroger or Publix down where we live, there aren't many grocery stores. Like they're being bought up by, bigger companies, and there might be, 8 or 10 grocery store chains across the country, and that's not going to make prices go lower. Prices will be higher. Worker shortage is another thing. If you're working in the food industry and you can't find workers, well, you got to pay more, and prices are going to be passed along.
Yeah, all of these are components of supply and demand. That's what we talked about at the top of the hour, right? That's such an important understanding. Go Econ Ed Month. Everybody take an economics class and teach your kids. All of these components go into supply and demand and where prices come from. Like you mentioned, bananas. So that's what I was reading this morning, right? We're having this longshoremen strike now, and all of the ports on the eastern side in the Gulf. Longshoremen strike. 75% of the bananas come in through those ports. What do you think is going to happen to the prices of bananas in the near term? We're going to see an increase in the price of bananas. It's how things work, right? There is no magic answer. It's complicated, and it's important to have an underpinning understanding of economics.
That longshoreman strike is particularly impactful here in Georgia because the port of Savannah is like the busiest port on the eastern seaboard. And that's going to happen. I mean, that's going to impact prices quickly, right? Because I've been to that port, and it's something to behold. There's, hundreds of thousands of containers coming in through out of there all the time. And to think that that's just going to stop, like everything that I buy that comes into this country probably came through there. So that's going to be felt pretty quickly, I think.
Don't everybody go stock up on toilet paper. That's not an issue here. 90% of toilet paper manufactured in the U.S. So let's not do that and make the problem worse.
Brian, if we could talk just a second about I think one of the biggest stories of food inflation in the last couple of years, to me anyway, was the egg price spike.
Oh, yeah.
That was just, prices of eggs went through the roof, and it got a lot of political traction. And it was the bird flu, right? It's something, I'm not saying bird flu is simple, but it's something like birds get sick. And we've got an organization here in Georgia called the Georgia Poultry Association. We visited there with teachers, and Georgia is one of the largest egg and chicken producing states in the country, if not number one. So they have their finger on the pulse of bird flu and when it happens, how they respond to it. And something as simple as that, like birds get sick and they start dying off and they're not producing the eggs. Boom, that's going to ripple through the economy very quickly. And prices spiked, and that got all the attention. But now when I go to the grocery store, egg prices are low again, like they have been historically. And you never hear about it, right? You never hear people going on, egg prices are so cheap. So I think we like to focus on when prices are higher, but not talk so much when they come back down. Gas is another example right now. Gas prices in Georgia continue to fall.
Yeah.
You don't hear about it.
No.
Right? When they go up, it's a big thing, right?
Yeah, it's below $3 a gallon. Yeah. It's unfortunately it's bad news that travels fast, and the way that the social media algorithms work is people, comments or complaints, and that's what gets traction. And it's frustrating because a lot of that traction escapes truth, and things like bird flu causing egg prices in the midst of COVID to skyrocket just doesn't make it into the world of Facebook and Twitter or X or whatever it may be. And as you're saying all these things, like you said, it's complicated. I mean, you have an element of the inputs that go into the goods and services that could be rising, but then you have that difference between that and what people are paying, and those are corporate profits. And before you think, oh yeah, it's all, these damn companies they're charging too much. Well, okay, if you think they're charging too much, like that's a lesson to invest in the market, because in the financial markets, because that means they're profiting and their stock prices are going to go up, and so contribute more to your 401k. It's like all of these things are there's always a winner and a loser, and these things are always like constantly changing and adjusting. And it's important not to get like bogged down into like this simple idea of like it's this one thing that's causing inflation. And one, yes, please, Dr.
I do
Davidson.
want to make one point, and it's sort of related to what you were just saying. There is a real necessity for competition to make a market work efficiently. And so that is
Yes,
one thing that I brought up too, that we may want to expand upon for just a second here. We are
please do.
seeing this consolidation in food markets, in manufacturing markets. So for example, soda prices are really high, right? Well, the top three companies, Coke, Pepsi, Keurig, Dr. Pepper, control 90% of the soda market. So when you don't have competition for that downward pressure on prices, there is this huge potential for an increase in prices. It's not unique to soda.
No.
Kraft Heinz dominates the cheese industry, 65% of the market. It's true in chocolate. You have Hershey, Mondelez, Mars, 80% of the market. So we are seeing that consolidation, which was probably something we do need to keep our pulse on.
Think of like the airline industry, another one. How many airlines are there these days?
Right.
Yeah.
Not many. And especially, Brian and I live in Atlanta, and you fly out of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, you're probably going to fly Delta.
Mm-hmm.
So folks in other parts of the country, their Delta prices seem to be a little bit lower than mine sometimes because they have more choice than I do.
Yeah. So competition. Also, we're stressing the independence of the Fed. We also need to stress the independence of competition. Sorry.
No, that's well said.
Importance of competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and we're seeing it all over the place. And one thing I want to add to rising prices is that those prices rose for 4 years, but we did not, just because inflation's at 2 to 3% right now, doesn't mean that those prices are going to return to 2020 prices. Wages are now outpacing the increase in the prices of the things we buy. So on average, our wages are growing faster than what we're buying. So there's two sides to that story, right? I mean, that's the way it happens in economic cycles. That's the last thing that occurs after prices increase. People get frustrated, they get upset, they start demanding from their bosses wage increases. And then they get wage increases. That's a natural cycle that's occurred for 100 years. That's very, very normal. And we don't want deflation. Deflation's very bad. If you think inflation's bad, try deflation, and you can trace that back to 1929 and see what deflation did to our economy then. Okay, so the next question that I have for you too, and I think we've covered a lot of these things, but so we might need a little bit of review and maybe we add to it. But what were the contributing factors to the inflation spike around 2020 and afterward?
I'll start and then Mike fill in. Really twofold, I think. And we talked a little bit about supply chain issues. That was a huge thing after COVID, right? Things are shutting down, businesses are shutting down. So we get this bottleneck, then this mismatch of supply and demand. So that's a huge cause of prices necessarily rising, right? How do you clear the market? Prices rise. That's economics 101. But also we had huge injections into the economy from Congress, right? Trying to boost the economy, help the American people by ensuring people who are out of work still had money to keep the economy going. You can't just have everything shut down and then actual crisis. So just the injections into the economy, also Econ 101, if you inject money in, you're going to see prices rise. So just want to remind people there were 3 rounds of these injections into the economy, March 2020, December 2020, and then again in March 2021. So that is necessarily going to lead to some inflationary pressure. And then you have the Fed step in eventually and try to tamp that down and control the inflation.
So when were the 3 and I want to remind folks that in COVID, there were a lot of people who were not allowed to work. They lost their jobs. I mean, the unemployment rate went to 15%. Let's not forget that. It went to 15%. And so Congress sent essentially money to people in the form of, it could have been, was it tax credits or was it just a straight check?
It was cash. Yeah, straight cash.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And so there were 3 rounds. What were the dates?
Yeah, March 2020, I can tell you the amounts even. March 2020, it was $1,200 per tax filer and $500 per child. December 2020 was $600 per tax filer and $600 per child. And then the last one, it was March 2021, it was $1,400 per tax filer and $1,400 per child.
Okay. And
So
how much was it per child in the last one?
$1,400.
1,400. Okay. Mike, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, the supply chain issue, which Jennifer brought up, another thing sort of that, again, I've mentioned a few times, like this global economy. So like when we open back up in our country, people are like, all right, let's go again. We got this. China was still shut down for many, many, many months more.
Right.
When many people were thinking, oh, things should get back to normal. Well, if you're a company importing, 80% of your parts from China or some other country that's still shut down, you're out of luck, right? And you couldn't go on, like car manufacturers kind of got stuck this where they were buying their sort of chips they need for their vehicles coming all out of China. They couldn't produce vehicles.
Right.
Because this other country still shut down and supply just wasn't there. So that's a big part of it, I think.
And it wasn't just China, right? I mean, it was a lot of the Asian nations.
Yes. Yeah.
Where I
think we were one of the first countries to sort of like get back to normal and let's get back working. And Jennifer mentioned these injections of cash. Like in my household, we're shut down. We're not going to work. We're not going out to eat. We're not going shopping and stuff like that. And all of a sudden you do get all this money and it opens back up, everyone at the same time, because a lot of people paid down their debt during COVID because they weren't out spending money. But all of a sudden the floodgates open and everyone, let's go out again. And Friday night, everyone's out at the restaurants. And again, restaurants can't find workers and the prices are going to be passed along to consumers. So much of what we talked about in question 3 are kind of the same answers here. Just the many different factors coming together all at once in this kind of perfect storm to, make the supply and demand kind of get wacky and prices go up.
And again, I'll post the charts that go along with this so you can see for yourself like the wackiness over those. It was really about a year and a half. Well, if you look at it over 3 years, like the wackiness of COVID, like the 2020 and then what happened. And it's pretty insane to look at the significant changes historically speaking, but then how quickly the changes were, right? I mean, we returned to normal when you look at the big picture, like crazy fast when you look at the span of like 100 years and typically what happens when there's a recessionary gap. Well, I guess
right.
Go ahead.
You mentioned a couple seconds ago about workers, demanding higher wages and getting them.
Yep.
And I think in the last couple of years, maybe not my entire lifetime, but in many years that I remember, unions have sort of been winning some bargaining sessions. And that sort of hasn't happened in a long time in our country. So auto workers, UPS workers, like they're getting pretty substantial raises. And again, the businesses aren't going to just eat those costs. They're going to pass things along to us. So that whole idea of workers kind of unionizing and collective bargaining with each other and demanding higher wages and getting it, I think that's had a little bit of an impact in some areas.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. And I'm saying this as a former Teamster member, by the way.
When I was in the data though. That's what's so great about our conversation here. It is what it is. As a Modern Husbands podcast listener, you recognize the importance of evidence-based advice from leading national experts for your marriage. That's why we know you will love our marriage toolkit. Nearly 50 national experts came together to provide bite-sized advice to manage the toughest topics couples face in managing money in the home as a team. Go to modernhusbands.com for your free preview of our marriage toolkit to start, strengthen, or rebuild your marriage. Once again, that's modernhusbands.com to sign up for your free preview of our marriage toolkit. Now back to the show. So moving on, there's the question that I think is important to answer here, and I guess the patriotic Brian Page is coming out here. But how did the United States perform managing inflation relative to the rest of the world? Because this was a global COVID-induced, for the most part, inflationary crisis. So how do we do relative to the rest of the world?
I think, very well. So I've got some
Number
statistics.
one, Mike. You mean very well? Okay, ahead.
Well,
I'm starting to get excited here. Go ahead.
I've got us number 2.
Whoa, where did you get that?
So I've got information about the G7 countries.
Yep.
And I'm looking here at the largest decrease in inflation from post-COVID peak among the G7 countries. And according to the numbers I have, Italy is done a little bit better than we have.
Okay.
But we outpace Germany, UK, Canada, France, and Japan as far as coming out of inflation and making inflation levels come down. But I think this goes back to we're relatively in isolation as a country when we think about the world, because we are usually number one in everything. We're kind of far away from other countries. We have Canada and Mexico on our borders, but if you're living where Jennifer lives, those are pretty far away, right? So I think we tend to think with blinders on. We don't really think about the other parts of the world very often. But if you're living in Germany, you've got many countries around you, so you're probably more involved in thinking about them more and dealing with other countries, not on a daily basis, but a much more common basis. So for us, it's easy to not think about other countries and think that, gee, everyone might be going through the same kind of thing. And everyone kind of did go through the same kind of thing. And again, I think because of our Federal Reserve System, we've weathered the storm way better than other countries have, and continue to lead in many, different economic measures around the world. So I think we've done great compared to other places.
We're crushing it.
Yeah, we're blessed to live in the U.S. We are relatively stable, pretty much everything. So it is important for people to travel. I guess on this note, and maybe that's one of the things I want to say before we conclude here, is it's important to think broader, think about what your news sources are. You can get direct information. Fred is a great resource that Brian mentioned, St. Louis Fed. Fred, you can just Google that and you have access to real-time data without somebody intervening and trying to tell you what it says. You can see for yourself.
Yeah. And it's I get so frustrated when people don't Google things. It's like they'll ask some question like, you can look that up, right? And within seconds, you can have an answer to that.
Yeah.
And generally, if it's a trusted source like the St. Louis Fed, the numbers don't lie, right? Here it is. Here are the numbers.
That's the important piece. Trusted source, right?
Yeah.
And I'll put in our notes section, and I'll write a blog post about this that links a post that I did previously on taking the politics out of personal finance, where I literally took the primary prices and economic factors for that impact in American households. So like the unemployment rate, the price of food, et cetera. And I just literally embedded the Federal Reserve graphics that change in real time. So you can see for yourself just at that very moment how we're doing. And I'll have to check and see who has the latest report. My OECD report for the G7 inflation rates have us currently beating in Italy. But Italy was beating us. Maybe I'm wrong, Mike. I hope I'm not. I hope we're number one. I hate being number two. If you're not first, you're last. But
I think mine was from July, the information I have. So maybe yours is September. I don't know.
God, I hope so. I hope so. A little American pride kicking in here. All right. So the opposite of inflation is deflation, right? And so for folks, as a reminder, deflation is when prices are going down. Inflation or when prices are going up. Okay, so what's worse, a 10% inflation rate or a 10% deflation rate, and why? Whoever wants to take that one.
Sure. I mean, deflation is worse. It starts this downward spiral. I think one of the things is people forget that wages are a price. And so when you're seeing decrease in prices, that means decreasing wages also.
Mm-hmm.
And it just, it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. Once you get on that road, it just really spirals downward. It's not a good situation at all. I would much rather I don't want 10% inflation, but I would rather have 10% inflation.
Mike, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think about when I used to teach high school and, teaching the law of supply and that students, I think, have a little harder time grasping that than they do the law of demand. And if, prices are going down and you're a supplier, are you going to want to supply? No,
Right.
I don't want to produce anymore because I'm not making as much money, so I'm not going to produce as much anymore.
So if you have, let me put this in a practical way to folks who have a mortgage. Let's say you have $1,000 a month mortgage. I'm throwing it out there, and you're making $2,000 a month, right? Basic. Just okay, let's make it $4,000 a month. You're making $4,000. You have $1,000 mortgage. Massive deflation comes along, and you are now making $2,000 a month because of deflation. Well, you still have the $1,000 mortgage, right? And so people forget that a lot of our most expensive monthly costs are fixed, whether it's a mortgage, like your home loan, an auto loan, a student loan. And if you have rising wages, those fixed costs are actually over time less expensive for you, which in the long run, we're going to look back at this in 10 years and say, okay, inflation was not good at that time, but boy, oh boy, I'm glad that I have much higher wages now because my fixed debt from the student loan, from the mortgage or whatever, that's nothing. That's nothing. Whereas deflation, it crushes you. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay. So just a couple more quick ones. What are some practical ways couples can manage higher prices in their homes?
Jennifer, you want to start that?
Sure.
Okay.
So first of all, it's hard for sure. And I want to ensure that we have empathy for people, and nobody's alone in this, right? It is just managing a household in general is hard, let alone when we have some increasing prices at the grocery store. So the biggest suggestion that I have is really just be mindful and do what you can do. So how we manage in our household for years, when we had way less income than we do now. I definitely grew up in not a high level household. So we're shopping sales. We're capitalizing on those when we can. We're eating what we have in the pantry. We're doing white label, all of those kinds of things. We eat top ramen. We eat a lot of peanut butter and jelly even today, though peanut butter is really expensive right now. I've seen
it is,
that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you just do what you can to help yourself, truly. As far as the grocery store, when eggs are expensive, don't buy them. Buy some other lower protein source. Pork is low right now. I did see that when I was looking at all the CPI. So
yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I bought a pork butt last weekend because of that, and that feeds that's multiple meals. Anyway, I digress. Yeah. Go ahead, Mike. What do you think?
I would say, re-examine your budget. I mean, if you're not like grocery shopping together, that might be an issue, and track your spending. I mean, obviously, if you are someone who buys, I usually buy 18 tubs of peanut butter a month, and prices are going through the roof. Maybe, as Jennifer said, think about some complementary goods. But I think the more you can share information with your spouse about your own personal spending habits, so that they know what you're doing and they know what's going on your half of the budget, I think it's going to do nothing but good things.
Yeah, budgeting is important. Absolutely. Yeah. I think people don't like to hear that, and it sounds a little bit like, oh, budgeting. Yeah, they always tell me that. I guess my point on that is budgeting is not meant to be this straitjacket. You sit down and do it when you're at your best, when you're really thinking about your future self and where you want to be, and it's just your roadmap to get there. I also want to say budgeting and spending money, it's not necessarily about how much you make. Of course, you need to be able to make a living wage and support your household, but it really is more about the decisions you make with the income that you have.
And I got to give a shout out to my local Sam's Club because I have saved a fortune buying in bulk there. Okay, so I have one final question, but I do want to put out a I want to have a little competition with Mike. Mike lives about 1.5 miles from me, and Mike, I think it's time you and I have a chili cook-off.
Oh, I'm in.
You in? This October, we're having a chili cook-off. Okay, all right.
One thing I have to throw out this October: if it's cool, if it's hot out, no.
Yeah, it's got to be cool. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
Chili,
okay.
Cold weather food.
What is, and I want each of you to answer this. What is one piece of simple and actionable advice you want to leave our listeners with as it pertains to higher prices?
I think I will go with if we're trying to keep prices lower prices. I think the idea of placing high tariffs on imported goods is not a great idea.
Why is that?
A tariff is a tax on an import. And again, I've come back to this whole globalized economy thing. Many of the goods I buy, whether I know it or not, are produced overseas. So if there's a tariff when they come into this country, I'm going to ultimately end up paying that tax because the importer company is going to pass it along to me. And if we decide to put tariffs on imports, the countries that we're doing it to are going to do that exact same thing back to us. So I think a bit of advice is be careful of wanting tariffs on imports because it's going to cause prices to go up even more.
Now I knew that was coming. Mike and I have been friends for a long time, and he has always been so passionate about international trade. That's always like his big thing. And I think part of that is because that's so important in the state of Georgia. But yeah, Mr. Mike Raymer that is his number one passion is international trade. So when you say the word tariffs, you can visibly see him kind of cringe because it really is just a tax on us. They're just going to raise their prices on us. Dr. Davidson, what about you?
Yeah, I think the bigger piece of advice I want to give people is to be careful of the media that you ingest, right? So yes, you're feeling and you're seeing some high prices at the store, but let's get to the actual root of it and the truth of the matter and get real-time, real data. So there's a media bias chart that you can just Google that. And those things that are high reliable, highly accurate, that's the media that you want. Not those that are more on the fringe that are maybe feeding you, or you have commentary from someone who's telling you their perspective or their slanted view of the situation. So primary sources, truth of the matter. That's really what I want people to get out of this.
Well, I will include again in the description, the notes, a link to a post where I will include that media bias chart. And I'll also include links to things just like Federal Reserve, where you can just see the data for yourself. So what a wonderful conversation. Thank you both for joining during Econ Education Month and having a conversation about inflation.
And Brian, if I could add one final thing. So it is Econ Ed Month, and I've got some stickers over on my desk behind me that says Econ is life. And I think Jennifer and I, and you yourself, Brian, we're passionate about economic education because I know in my heart of hearts, the more you know about basic economic concepts, the better decisions you'll make in life. Mm-hmm. And I can't encourage your listeners enough to sort of just learn, if you don't know it already, learn basic economic concepts like supply and demand and how that impacts the economy in your own life. And I think we'll all start making better decisions, which is what's better than that.
Yep.
Well said. Econ is life.
Econ analysis, it's the superpower. It's seeing the unseen. It really is this powerful tool that gives you this analytical tool to just get away from the rhetoric, and you're going to really understand the world and how it affects you better.
A special thanks to our guest and, of course, to all of our listeners. Don't forget to click subscribe wherever you download your podcast, give us a rating, and share the Modern Husbands podcast with others. Doing so goes a long way in growing our reach. And join your fellow Modern Husbands and have links to our podcasts, articles, and other resources to manage money in the home as a team sent to your inbox every 2 weeks by subscribing to our newsletter at modernhusbands.com. Until next time, be well.